Excellent. So, we're talking about autism and Asperger's today. And I know that you are an activist and an advocate for people with autism and Asperger's, and that you've written a book about it.
Yes, both of those things are true, and I have been now for very many years. I was diagnosed as autistic at the age of 7 and diagnosed as Asperger's syndrome at the age of 40 or 41. I'm not exactly sure which, although earlier than that I was aware of the existence of Asperger's, and since then I've been very much involved in advocacy, even though before I had qualified and did practice as a special education needs teacher and lecturer.
And as we were talking about earlier, since autistic people and people with Asperger's make up a small percentage of the population, policymakers are not always interested in helping them. They sort of take a back seat.
That's very true. In fact, in my experience, the opposite is true. They are not in the least bit interested because, as you rightly say, the autistic percentage within any given population is around 2%, which is to say around 1 in 50 people. People with Asperger's syndrome are much, much rarer than that. And the bottom cynical line, and what makes this so outrageous, and what makes me want to advocate and to put this message over, is that because there is such a small percentage, politicians don't want to know because there are so few votes in it. And there needs to be a complete change of understanding because people with autism and with Asperger's syndrome, either or, can make a massive contribution to society instead of being either sidelined or in many cases actively victimized by it. And this is what I'm trying to put over and the reason why I wrote the book.
So, one of the questions that crops up frequently in discussions about autism is whether there are more people who are being diagnosed or more people developing it, and what is causing it.
Well, my suspicion is that, to start with your final question first, is that autism is of two kinds, and I have explained my theory of this in the book. There is what I call classical autism, which is entirely inherited, and there is acquired autism. The fact about autism is that it is what's called it's a syndrome, and a syndrome is defined as a constellation of agreed symptoms. That is to say, ticking off a number of boxes, and if a person ticks enough of those boxes in terms of their behavior, the way they present themselves, and obviously clinical and psychological testing, then they are classified as autistic and or Asperger's syndrome. Classical autism, as I say, is entirely inherited, and I suspect that it has been so for a very, very long period of time. As science and education and understanding have improved, then our ability to recognize and therefore diagnose people has improved, and basically we're spotting a lot more autistic people than we used to. In terms of acquired autism, which I explain in the book, which can be caused by a number of things, including brain diseases like meningitis or things like heavy metal poisoning, which can change at any age a normal person to having and exhibiting that constellation of symptoms, that's what I call acquired autism. And those things are, of course, now, because we have definitions of autism and of Asperger's, particularly within the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, issued by the World Health Organization, we are able to recognize that now and diagnose it. But my guess is that the actual percentage of population with autism probably hasn't changed, but what really has changed is our ability to recognize people with autism, which, you know, has not been available, you know, before quite recent times. To give an example, the term Asperger's syndrome, to my knowledge, was never in the teaching curriculum in Britain before 1996. It was simply not recognized, even though Dr. Hans Asperger, after whom it was named, recognized this subcategory or subset of autism back in 1942.
So, what exactly are the differences between autism and Asperger's syndrome?
It's a difficult question to answer. In my practice, I have found many people who are autistic, but not Asperger's, but I have never yet found anyone with Asperger's syndrome who does not display at least two of the prerequisites for autism. Asperger's syndrome is about a different part of the brain being affected. If one inherits autism, it means that the brain physically, as well as biochemically, develops differently. Someone with Asperger's syndrome, the same thing applies, but in a different area, particularly the left frontal lobes, although other areas as well. And we can see when we look at the genetics, the difference in the sequences between a person with Asperger's syndrome and a person who is autistic but without Asperger's syndrome. I have to emphasize this is an area of biophysics which we still do not fully understand. But what is very interesting to note is that people with Asperger's syndrome, regardless, are on average 10% more intelligent than their peers are. And Asperger's syndrome occasionally produces some of the great geniuses whose names are almost household these days, including Nikola Tesla, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and it's rumored, although I don't know this for a fact, and it's never been either confirmed or denied, the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. And that's
And
just
Bobby
naming
Fischer.
half a dozen. And the great chess player Bobby Fischer, indeed, was also Asperger's syndrome.
As
There's
well
some
as Paul
controversy.
Morphy,
Yes,
and
indeed.
possibly Aaron Nimzovich, and quite a few chess players, I think, had the symptoms of Asperger's.
That's very true, I agree. I know there's some controversy about retrospective diagnosis of people of being Asperger's syndrome, and it's been much criticised. One of the people who's done this is Professor Michael Fitzgerald, who is head of psychology at Trinity College Dublin, and in my view the best authority in the world on Asperger's. But he does it with great knowledge, and the more we find out about genetics, and are able to test the genetic sequences from people long dead by taking samples from teeth or bones. Um, it, increasingly, this is supporting Professor Fitzgerald's position because there really are, as I've said before, these differences in the sequences. I've said that Asperger's syndrome is a subset of autism, or a superset of autism, if you prefer. What's very interesting is that many of the sequences which one finds in Asperger's are also common to schizophrenia, and we know that many geniuses have also been schizophrenics. Um, so it's very much like a Venn diagram. You have two circles or three circles which intersect at a certain point. Each circle is, let's say autism or schizophrenia, for example. But there is this shared commonality, which is Asperger's syndrome. It is both a part of both, but separate as well. And that's why I describe it as a subset.
Yes. And last I read, it is considered, like schizophrenia, a neurodevelopmental disorder, and some of the key genes that deal with the development of the brain are common to both.
That's correct, yes.
So it is fascinating to think about how all of these things fit together, how intelligence, perception of reality, perception of social situations, emotions all go together.
They do. I think that the way that I'm hoping to get people to think of autism and indeed schizophrenia and Asperger's syndrome is from an ontological perspective, whereas psychology and psychiatry tend to look at these things from an epistemological perspective. And to explain those two terms, ontology is about a state of being, about the state of consciousness. As you rightly say, about the perception of reality. Whereas epistemology is about knowledge, and this is where we get the diagnoses from and how the agreed constellation of symptoms we discussed earlier have been created. And when we see those things, a bit like looking at the plough in the sky, uh, the stars, um, we recognize that pattern as, yes, this is the plough, or this is the Great Bear. And that's why we describe these things as a constellation of symptoms. And that applies very much the same way to the epistemological approach. But what interests me and what I think is far more important in terms of experience and in terms of people understanding and in terms of my advocacy is the ontological experience, which is how a person feels, which is about how they communicate and how people communicate with them, how they express or don't express their emotions, their range of emotions, to bring it down to, everyday experience. For example, somebody with autism or Asperger's syndrome always has at least one of the five physical senses developed to a very unusual degree, whether it be taste or touch or hearing or either of the other two. Always. In my case, it's hearing. I can hear dog whistles, which most people can't. My hearing range is no greater than anybody else's, but it's different. I hear higher notes than other people can, but I don't hear the lower ones that many people can. And I've had that tested many times and confirmed uh, as part of my research.
Well, going back to the topic of emotions, a lot of people have this idea that people with autism or Asperger's are unemotional.
Yes, that is the perception that a great deal of the public do have, and this is again something I want to overturn completely. It's untrue. I think it's fair to say that people with Asperger's syndrome and autism have a narrower range of emotion, perhaps, but certainly they don't lack any depth. There is a theory that people with Asperger's syndrome particularly lack empathy. I think the truth is that the opposite is the case, that they are like very big radio receivers. They get in so much emotional and other information that they either process it very slowly, which makes them seem distant or aloof, or they cannot process it at all, which makes them seem unempathic. But I think that in fact they feel things far more deeply in many ways. Uh, People with Asperger's syndrome and autism um, generally, almost always in my experience, both personal and professional, are nature lovers. They thrive in natural environments as distinct from urban ones. They are very empathic toward animals, perhaps more so than they are towards other people. Something else I think is very important to understand is that autism is a whole body experience. It is, as you rightly say, a neurological issue, the actual physical development of the brain and the physical shape of the brain, but it also affects, of course, all the body. Um, we understand that with that difference in the brain comes some very clear differences in other areas of the body. Um, for example, uh, gut problems, particularly Crohn's disease and celiac disease. People with autism always have food intolerances, allergy problems, and they vary in how serious and how much they affect the person according to the individual. And these things that come with autism are called comorbidities, and you always find these uh, gastric problems with someone with autism. So that is why people with autism and Asperger's have the reputation of being, it's a phrase I hate, but picky eaters. They're not. They have an instinct about what will and will not upset them, and they always have to be very careful about diet. So as I say, it really is a whole body condition. It affects the senses in the way I've explained in my case about hearing, but I know other people who have Asperger's syndrome who are extraordinarily sensitive to touch, and there's always as well this underlying problem with uh, allergies, intolerances, and the whole matter of digestion. And these comorbidities are always present. And it's fascinating to read the diaries of people like Leonardo, for example, and their eating habits and so forth. I think another really good example of this, and somebody else who most certainly had Asperger's syndrome, would be Howard Hughes, the aviation pioneer and oil magnate.
Yes, yes. Returning to theories of autism, one in particular is popular, and I've seen it in a number of places, and that is that it is the result of an overly masculine brain.
Yes, that is a theory that's been put forward, and I think it's a theory that holds a great deal of water and is very valid by one of the world's great experts on Asperger's syndrome, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, who is head of the Autism Research Centre at the University of Cambridge in England. His theory is that the developmental change in the brain and indeed the rest of the body, which results in Asperger's syndrome, is caused by an excess of testosterone in the womb. Um, and the result of that, obviously, because testosterone is the male hormone, is that regardless of the gender of the child, they exhibit
Uh-oh.
very extra masculine uh, behavioral patterns. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that. And I know that he and his team have done a huge amount of research, and it's very, very interesting, and it's ongoing as well. And he calls
Another
it the extreme male brain theory of Asperger's syndrome.
another one is has to do with Neanderthal DNA.
Yes, it does. And that's a very good point that you raise. And it's always been seen that there is a conflict between that theory and between that of Professor Baron Cohen. I greatly disagree with that perception, and I've written about it in the book. We now know, because of genetic studies on bones that have been found, a great deal more about Neanderthal people than we knew, even let's say 20 years ago. Now, Neanderthals were a great deal larger than the average person is today. And it is not unreasonable to believe that they produced, as a result of that, more hormones, and that would certainly include testosterone. They would have to have done in order to grow to the size they did. They would have needed more growth hormone, HGH, human growth hormone, for example. And it's impossible to think, unrealistic to think, that they wouldn't have produced more testosterone as well. And it has been found, and Professor Baron Cohen is one of the people who's leading this research, that people with autism have a higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA in them, in their genome, than the average population does. And interestingly, that is also around 2% of the population have an above average level of Neanderthal DNA. The majority of people have about 1% of Neanderthal DNA in them. In my case, the percentage, and I've had 2 DNA tests, is 3.9%, which is a high figure, very, very high figure indeed. So, as I say, I see no conflict between Professor Baron Cohen's findings and the Neanderthal theory of autism and Asperger's syndrome. I think they fit together very, very nicely.
Yes, definitely the robust skeletons and muscular structures would be suggestive of higher testosterone and androgen levels. So I think you are absolutely right there.
one of the things we have to remember is that obviously the male gender has a far greater amount of testosterone in them than females do. But females, regardless of whether they're autistic or otherwise or normal, also have some testosterone in them. It's a very small amount, but it's always present. Um, if the female, for example, and the male both have a significantly greater proportion of Neanderthal DNA within them, then both will have a significantly greater proportion of testosterone in them. That will obviously produce a child and a womb with greater testosterone than normal. And that may well be certainly one of the causes of autism and of Asperger's syndrome.
Yes, and there may also be a predisposition. For instance, someone may be particularly sensitive to male hormones compared to another person, so the same womb conditions would affect two infants in different ways.
Absolutely right.
All right. Well, that was everything on the list. If there's something you want to add, feel free, but actually, we did add one thing. We added the bit about empathy, which I know you wanted.
Yes,
So we've covered it.
we have. How did it sound?
It sounded good. It sounded very good throughout. There were a couple of places where you broke up a little bit, but Google usually fixes those when it uploads the video. It was
Yeah.
minor, and it's not anything to get too worried about. So
Plus, we're not trying to be CBS here. I mean, this is supposed to be fairly visceral, isn't it?
oh,
You
it
know,
should be. I mean,
so I
it's
was, I was looking for the Orson Welles. I think it's so weird that the first one, the sound is fine in America and China, but it didn't work in Europe.